Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fifth and final event of the Moin Network's Global Gathering, which we have dedicated to the theme of redirecting finance for a just green transition. The Mission-Oriented Innovation Network, or MOIN, is housed here at the the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at the University College London, and it brings together over 90 leading global public sector institutions, including cities, state investment banks, innovation agencies, design agencies, and government sectoral units. And the network's aim is very much to share the challenges and opportunities they face when trying to create and nurture public value. And it also explores how mission-oriented innovation policies can tackle the grand challenges that society faces. So my name is Katie Kedward, and I am a policy fellow in sustainable finance here at the Institute. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our session this afternoon, which will look at the grand challenge of reorienting financial flows to support the transition to an economy that's not only green, but also just. Now, the topic of green finance very much took front and center stage at last year's COP26. And interestingly, the focus was very much on the vital role of the private sector in stepping up to provide the trillions needed for the green transition. Over 450 financial firms across 45 countries pledged to decarbonise their portfolios by 2050 as part of Mark Carney's Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. But interestingly, there were no major near-term decarbonisation commitments or roadmaps by these players announced. And indeed, our research at IIPP has explored the fact that there are two prominent market failures at play when it comes to financing the green transition. Firstly, the financial sector is continuing to pour capital into unsustainable sectors, facilitating carbon lock-in and other path dependency effects. And secondly, private finance is typically a poor provider of the type of finance required to scale up green innovation. So to that end, the provocation that this session will explore is how do we attract not just more finance, but the right kinds of finance, that is long-term patient capital for rapidly scaling up green innovation? And what is the role of public policy and public financial institutions in addressing this challenge? I'm therefore delighted to welcome our panelists to this session who bring a wealth of expertise and experience to our conversation this afternoon. Firstly, we have Mariana Mazzucato, who is Professor in the Economics of Innovation and Public Value at University College London and the founding director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Then we have Shiva Dustdar, who currently heads the Innovation Finance Advisory Division at the European Investment Bank, which she set up in 2013. And she has over 25 years experience in innovation financing at JP Morgan and Fitch Ratings. Then we have Dan Adler, who is Senior Advisor for Climate Finance at the California Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development and the Infrastructure and Economic Development Bank, or IBank, where he is leading the development of the Climate Catalyst Fund. And last but not least, I'm delighted to also welcome Jill Earthy, who is the recently appointed CEO of INBc Investment Corp in Canada, a newly created $500 million public investment fund that will help British Columbia-based businesses grow and diversify the economy. So without further ado, I will hand over to Mariana, who will kick off our discussion this afternoon with learnings on green finance from IIPP's research and policy practice. Over to you, Mariana.
Sure, thanks Katie for that introduction, and to Nora and the IPP team for putting all this together. And of course to the participants today, many of which are collaborators with IIPP on not just MOIN, but also some of the deep dives we've been doing and actually getting our hands dirty with the kind of redesign of some policies and institutions. Shiva and I have been longtime colleagues in the European Commission work, where the missions concept actually on the back of 2 years of work with Carlos Modes's team from IIPP, we actually managed really in some ways to introduce this concept that now is taking off. And I think our responsibility is to make sure we don't get lazy with it. I always say, you know, if you get too happy and cozy with missions, it means we're not doing the right thing. It's supposed to be a provocation and a new way to actually design, whether it's industrial strategy, innovation policy, and finance. So today's we're focusing on finance. And maybe I could just say 4 super quick things. We only have 5 minutes, so literally 30 seconds on each 4. First, what we always begin with in IPP is the point that finance is not neutral. The quality matters. There's actually plenty of finance out there. It's often, for example, too patient. And that's actually that second point. Impatient finance, so exit-driven finance, even in the venture capital sector, actually created all sorts of damage in sectors like the biotechnology sector, which, being science-based, actually requires not just the patience, but also in that phase, the so-called Death Valley phase, that can last 10 or 15 years. So if the exit-driven finance that wants to exit through an IPO or a buyout is 3 or 5 years, that can actually really damage that learning by doing and trial and error process. The other thing is the direction, the direction of finance. So, in the UK, something like 80% of finance goes back to finance, insurance, and real estate. So this kind of ultra financialization of finance, where finance is financing finance, sounds good, is a huge problem. And so that issue about how actually to set up institutions like public banks that provide not only patient finance, but also to help steer that finance both back into the real economy instead of into the financial sector, but also within the real economy, really catalyze a transformation of sectors. This is really where a lot of our work has been. So in helping to set up, for example, the Scottish National Investment Bank in Scotland from scratch, the idea was really to work with the Scottish government on how this bank that was providing patient finance could help steer finance to those organizations that were willing, so picking the willing, not picking winners, picking the willing that were willing, sorry, I'm saying willing too much, those organizations, small, medium, and large. So it shouldn't just be biased on one type of firm, but it should be biased on those that are both capable and willing to transform. And sometimes on that, it doesn't happen just on its own. One thing that we've been working on is this issue of conditionality. Coming back to Scotland, they actually have a business pledge where there's I can't remember now, something like 12 criteria that they, that the government thinks businesses should actually be pledging to, that are, the obvious things like the living wage, but also reinvestment of profits, investment in worker training, and definitely all sorts of different criteria around sustainability. Well, that pledge, does it just remain this kind of, club that voluntarily businesses can sign up to, or does it become a requirement of, list of things that you have to kind of be doing or trying to do? Sometimes it's harder for the smaller companies in order to access public finance. And that issue of conditionality also has been quite important for countries with a Green Deal agenda, like in Germany, where the Energiewende mission up top for, around decarbonizing every sector. It's been interesting to see how that has then landed in their own public bank with the KfW. For example, the loans given out to the steel sector were indeed, on the back of the Energiewende, conditional on steel. And think of also cement was required there, the steel sector reducing its material content, which they did through repurpose, recycle, and reuse innovations across the entire value chain. Whereas, as we know, steel is getting all sorts of bailouts and handouts across the world without any conditionality. And lastly, some of our work, besides the work we've actually done with particular organizations, whether it's the EIB, where Shiva works, the Scottish National Investment Bank, and so on, some of our research has actually been trying to really document the degree of crowding in and catalyzing in. I don't like the word crowding in because it still sounds bad, right? Crowding out is bad. Crowding in is supposed to be good, but it's still crowding. It's amazing that we don't have positive terminology. In my book, The Entrepreneurial State, I called it dynamizing in, but we need better evidence for that, because the problem is, again, that if it's supposed to be catalytical and help to redirect towards really important mission-oriented goals, whether it's reducing the digital divide, carbon neutrality, and so on, we need to make sure that things are happening that wouldn't have happened otherwise. That's kind of the definition of additionality. So public investment catalyzing and crowding in investment that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And unfortunately, there's not that much evidence on that. And so we also need better data sets, better methodologies for it. And we have 2 or 3 PhD students actually who are pursuing that. But that itself becomes a very good indicator for the banks themselves to hold themselves accountable, that they're not just kind of handing out money that then just kind of allows inertia to happen. So I think my 5 minutes are exactly up. So happy to move on.
That was great, Mariana. Very succinct, actually. And thank you for that excellent introduction, which really well summarizes the kind of main challenges to this perspective that private finance are the best placed actors to kind of accelerate finance for the green transition. I'm going to hand over now to Shiva, who can sort of share with us her experiences of applying these kind of frameworks on the ground at the European Investment Bank. So over to you, Shiva.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you to IIPP and you all, and especially to Mariana for the wonderful collaboration that we have been embarking on. And it's really nice to stay in touch and as you say, keep up that mission thinking in both the EIB and also the European Commission. So by way of very brief introduction, I hope you all know who the what the EIB stands for, the European Investment Bank. Otherwise, you're really missing out, and you better check it up. I won't use the 5 minutes to introduce you per se to the EIB, but just let it be known to be the Bank of the European Union, but also with a big ambition to be the EU climate bank. Now, what does that mean? What it means is that since basically last year, all our activities are now in agreement with the Paris Accord. So, financing advisory, it's 100%. Our target is by 2025, 50% of all our financing is going towards climate action and environmental sustainability, and then the other 50% should certainly do no harm. And then the main thing, perhaps for this conversation, we also have set up a target of having €1 trillion mobilized of other financing with our financing in this crucial decade. So if you therefore look at these ambitions, I'm speaking now from the part of the EIB Advisory. And what really comes out here is that there is an important role that EIB Advisory plays. Just maybe very quickly, we have within advisory an area called the Innovation Finance Advisory, and we have sort of 3 main areas of activities. One is providing project advisory support, meaning helping companies, but also governments to have bankable projects that can actually feed into the EIB pipeline, but also generally have better access to financing. We also do market assessments to better understand what are the next big things. We have right now some going on nature-based solutions, on quantum technology. So the whole gambit of the whole spectrum of what innovations, so green, digital, and everything in between. And then thirdly, we also are actively involved in ecosystem development. Now, when it came to the missions, and it was really, we were very grateful to Mariana to have brought us relatively early on, actually, or I would say from the outset, as sort of her sounding board when she was, when IIPP was advising the European Commission on missions. But what was really useful is that then IIPP took sort of deep dive and looked at the EIB Advisory in actually looking at it from sort of a retrospective of what did EIB Advisory do to bring in a circular economy mindset into the EIB. And that report is actually available on IIPP's website. It's also available on our own website. All you need to do is Google, I guess, Mariana, EIB and missions. Mariana Mazzucato.
I've just put it in the chat. I put it
Excellent.
in the chat.
I definitely recommend that report, not because I think it actually is quite insightful to sort of see how a bank like the EIB can become actually quite, I would say, mission critical to the EU missions. And in particular, I think what the report is recommending is that we continue building our in-house expertise, with that meaning that we don't just sort of have an approach of outsourcing. I think that is very much in line with Mariana's overall philosophy. Make sure that the public sector is builds on its expertise and continues to create that knowledge, that we use, in fact, the knowledge that we are creating then within the EIB and use EIB Advisory as a change agent within the organization, and especially now looking at missions, when you have some major new initiatives and also the climate agenda, you do need to have this mindset of a change agent. And then thirdly, that we actually use all of that knowledge and expertise to develop the appropriate financial instruments that actually are, using these risk sharing mechanisms and provide that sort of long-term patient capital with the right directionality. So if you look at these 5 EU missions that are now in place, in a way, I would say that our advisory team is very much, and that has actually been agreed with the European Commission as recent as just a week ago. We are the entry point, so to speak, for the requests that will come from the various missions to the EIB. So in some ways, we will bring in some mission thinking inside the EIB, but equally, the EIB will bring some financial expertise to the EU mission, both secretariats, mission boards, and the wider community. So I think it's this symbiotic relationship that ultimately will be absolutely critical. And we are, still early days, but if you look at these 5 missions, 4 of them are very much sort of in the climate space. There is the sweet spot is quite large between the agenda of these green missions, or the missions in general, and the EIB's ambition of becoming the EU climate bank. And I stop here. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Shiva. It's really interesting to see how the governance and processes of what you've set up at InnoFin are really, really guided by these top-level, high, ambitious missions, as you put it, but also the degree that InnoFin are really investing in capabilities rather than, the common trend that we've seen in recent years of outsourcing capabilities to the private sector. So it would be really interesting now to invite Dan to present his thoughts, and also both Dan and Jill to kind of compare and contrast with approaches across the Atlantic Ocean. So I will pass over to Dan now to introduce his work.
Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you to the IIPP team for the chance to join you and share some of what's going on out here in the nation state of California. Dan Adler, I'm duly posted at the moment with the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, which actually houses the State Infrastructure Bank. And despite that word salad, it's actually a pretty important synergy as we're thinking about green banks, which is a phrase that gets tossed around increasingly in the US, I think globally, beneficially because it suggests momentum. But we have to be clear what they are and why they matter. They're clearly not commercial banks. It should not be an investment bank, meaning alpha or profit seeking. This is development banking in, I think, the best classical sense, meaning focusing on social issues, being motivated by public policy, but getting into transactions and motivating deals that wouldn't otherwise happen. I mean, it's brass tacks at that level. So the Infrastructure Bank in California has almost a 30-year track record of municipal, sort of plain vanilla infrastructure investment, lending to local governments to do parking lots and bridges and such. Great work. Now we're trying to aim it at the infrastructure challenge, which manifests itself as climate and sustainability, and open the aperture to private borrowers. Not doing that just to be sort of dumb money in a transaction or the lowest cost capital, but actually focusing on closing deals that wouldn't otherwise take place and that are closely aligned with the policy agenda of California. So where does this fit in the architecture of California's policy agenda and its financial community and its innovation environment? We have a lot going on out here. We've been pushing these issues for 3 decades through aggressive policy. We benefit from an amazing innovation ecosystem that is sort of orthogonal, tangential to IT and bioscience. So when we took a run 15 years ago in what we now call Clean Tech 1.0, and really spurring innovation through the venture channel, we had a chance with the formation of a group called the California Clean Energy Fund, which I was privileged to help launch and ultimately run, now known as New Energy Nexus, a global platform some of you may be familiar with, amazing organization for incubation of young companies around the world with a sustainability emphasis. We had a partnership model in mind with a little bit of public capital that came to the nonprofit organization from the state, that we could align ourselves with the emergent class of venture capitalists that saw sustainability as a key thesis, a key growth driver. And we would provide them policy insights as a founding strategic limited partner in their venture funds. They would go forth, raise other money, and flood the field with innovative ideas and help these young companies enter this industrial ecosystem and take their ideas to scale. What ultimately happened was a confluence of a few things. They raised way more money than they expected to. This was shortly after the Al Gore Inconvenient Truth and the green rush that started there. And they basically decided that they didn't need advice on public policy because they were the masters of the universe and they knew how to disrupt industries. They'd done it before, they were going to do it again. So to Mariana's early point, they just flooded a lot of money into these young companies, which you'd think if you're a startup, that's not a bad problem. People want to give me a lot of money. That's great. I'll take it. But it actually is deeply destructive to the sort of patient and integrated innovation system that we need, because it inflates, number one, the valuation of the company. And it makes it harder for them to justify their existence and raise more money further on, because now instead of being a patient little $20 million company, they've got a $100 million valuation. And so next investors are going to say, wait a minute, what have you done to justify that? I'm not going to give you any more money. So it actually can shut a meaningful door later on. And then by not aligning themselves continuously with public policy, they missed the key thesis here, which is this is slow work. This is industrial scale, big, heavy stuff. This is not the virtual economy of the digital era. These are big machines. These are things you can drop on your foot. And you have to be closely aligned with public policy at every step of the way if you want to succeed as an investor. So that was not a good outcome. And this story really hasn't been written in a public way, what venture capital did and importantly did not do with billions of dollars of risk equity on a global scale in the last 2 decades. Not a lot to show for it. So patient equity is now beneficially a theme amongst some of the more enlightened private investors, but still that's just to keep one part of the challenge. And California is doing everything it can to shape a policy environment which is aggressive across all the sectors that matter for climate. We've got goals coming out of our ears. We're not hitting them in almost every case, but we've got the right goals. We listen to science, we listen to the COP, we say we're going to do this by 2030. We've got nice innovation now. It's starting to come up the J curve. We're putting $3 billion a year of grant money, free public capital into companies and into projects. Now what we're trying to add is a scalable, green eye shade, policy aligned debt instrument in the form of the infrastructure bank's capabilities, again, aimed at climate, taking in capital from all sources, aligning ourselves with the policy community at every step of the way. This is banking. We should not be policy setting actors. We need to know where the science is. So we've got an Air Resources Board, a Natural Resources Agency. We've got agencies covering the field for all the climate goals. They tell us where the science and innovation needs to head. We align ourselves with the iterative process of their policymaking and ambition, and then we go and find transactions that move that along. We can come in as an investor, and these are early days. I don't want to get ahead of myself. We're just standing this up now, but we are live. We have capital. We're starting with the most urgent climate challenge in the state, which is forest wildfire. How do we take this biomass, which is destroying environments and destroying lives and economies, and turn it into a resource for advanced energy and advanced construction materials? Next phase is climate smart ag, hopefully circular economy, definitely interested in the conversation there. But continuing to push at the transactional level to close deals that advance the policy goal and justify the venture capital continuing to do what they do best and the young entrepreneurs that are excited by showing that we're rounding out the tool set. We've got all the goals we need. So let me close with a couple of provocations, I guess, to pick up on the theme. Additionality at the transactional level is really hard. When you're looking at something that has happened only a few times around the world, and you have to put that through your investment mindset and say, did my dollar as a public investor actually make this thing happen? Or would it have happened otherwise? You can kind of get balled up on that. And I know it's crucial that we have a framework for thinking it through, but we got to get some stuff done at the same time. So at the end of the day, it's like we came in, we closed the deal, maybe we lowered the cost of the energy commodity, which in California is crucial. We're a high energy cost environment. It burdens low income folks, and for a just transition, we got to get this stuff down the cost curve even as we go upscale. So that might be enough just to say we did it and it's a little bit cheaper than it otherwise would have been. Patient capital. It matters, obviously, but patience has to have foresight. You have to know what you want to have happen, not just what needs to happen, but at the individual deal level, you have to know how this fits in the broader social transformation. So patience plus insight, where does that insight come from? It only comes from partnership with public policy and having that translational research across transactions and investment, science, and the policymaking environment. Policymakers don't understand markets. That's been a real insight for me as I come back into this work after 10 years in the venture world. but we have to be able to communicate in a new way. So the framework of the Catalyst Fund is 3 parts, and then I'll close. The fund, yes, we need capital. We need public capital to help lead deals, not just wait for things to come. We have to understand transactions and infrastructure and investment on the ground. California is a tough place to do business. Many advanced economies are. Get in there, understand what it takes to build something in a regulatory environment like California. Workforce, land use, local governments. And then governments working together. We've got agencies A, B, C, and D sending a signal here, do this. Other ones say, don't do that. Here's money to do this. Here's money to not to do that. What, $3 billion every year into this environment, money coming from the federal government, making sure that governments actually communicate with one another, send unified signals, and think about what it's like as an investor and as an entrepreneur. Then we'll have the sort of reinforcing mechanisms that really can get us to scale in the short time frame we have. Otherwise, it's a bureaucratic nightmare, and young entrepreneurs and investors will find something else to do in other sectors, and that would be the worst mistake to make at this point in our critical evolution. So threw a lot out at you. Thank you again for the chance, and really looking forward to the conversation to come.
That was fascinating, Dan. Thank you so much. What came really strongly across for me there was this emphasis on policy coordination and joined up thinking in order to harness those positive spillover effects that we can get from public finance. And it's really interesting to hear not only the successes, but also the learnings from 30 years of doing this work in California. So from a very well-established public investment fund to a newly set up one, I'm going to hand over now to Jill Earthy to talk about INBc and its ambitions for the future.
Great, thank you. And I'm sitting here just north of Dan in beautiful British Columbia on the coast of Canada, west coast of Canada, and on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples. So really thrilled to be here, thrilled to be involved in this conversation. Mariana and the IIPP team have been involved in working with our provincial government to set up this fund. And I just stepped into the role in December, so quite brand new, and it's been extraordinary. So thrilled to be here to tell you a little bit about what we're thinking, where we're at, but also to learn and to listen. So the British Columbia economy has been transitioning over the last couple of years from a resource-based economy to looking at innovation in a more holistic way across a variety of sectors. We have a very diverse geography, and as some of you may have heard too, even just looking at the last year, in addition to the pandemic, we've had some extreme weather events. We've had extreme heat dome, we've had flooding, we've had all of these just extraordinary events. That's really, when I look at the work we're about to do at INBc, it's just, now is the time. And I know everybody here is feeling that urgency to act and to think differently and to create new models for impact. So as was mentioned in the introduction, INBc is a new Crown Corporation, as I said, formed by the provincial government with a $500 million strategic investment fund. And we're really focused on facilitating that economic recovery, but also supporting startups, helping promising companies, of course, to grow and scale up, attract more talent and investment to our province, but to have an impact not just in our province, but of course beyond. And we're focused on a triple bottom line mandate, which again, you're all familiar with, but looking at people and looking at how the well-being of our people, but looking through the lens of course, job creation is one thing, but also incorporating and embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion and reconciliation into all of our decisions. So that's from our investment decisions, that's from looking at our team. Also, as mentioned around conditionality, that's something we're really interested in. How do we influence more systemic change through our partners, through our investees, through the funds we look at, and looking at some of those conditions that we can apply. Of course, planet. I mentioned the extreme weather events. We all know what's going on. And so looking at low carbon innovation and how that, the benefits there. So looking at that lens. And then of course, profit. We do want this to be a profitable fund so that we can reinvest back into the economy and continue to grow and evolve it into an evergreen fund. So looking at it from that holistic lens for bigger impact. So, and then of course, we're looking at other considerations around sectors, around stage of business, around asset classes, around geography. And so we have this multifaceted framework that we're developing, which is exciting. But we're also at that point too, as we're building it out, we can't do it all. We can't do it all right away. We're not going to make everybody happy, but we want to make a lot of people happy and feel that they're part of this and part of the solution. So working through all of that, in the process right now of building our team, of finalizing our investment policy statement. We've had over 250 consultations to help inform that, and that's been really, really helpful. And, you know, we're fortunate here in Canada and BC, there is lots of capital. That was mentioned before too, but we're really looking at that being that inclusive, that additive, that patient capital that we're all talking about. And the other, you know, just as a quick fact, there was a report that came out recently that, you know, British Columbians and the companies that were raising money here had a record year in 2021, actually a 300% increase in capital. There are a few outliers, of course, but actually only 25% of that capital came from Canada. Rest of the capital came, significant portion, of course, to our friends in the South, 66%, and the rest from foreign investors. So we think there's an opportunity. We want some more local capital to be able to support our companies to grow, scale, and keep the IP and the jobs, some of them here in our country and in our province. But one of the things about some of this data, we look at the amount of capital that's out there, and I like to dig in and who is getting that capital, right? Who's receiving that capital? And there are a number of underrepresented groups, as we know, in a lot of the data that's out there. So I really think there are significant opportunities to expand that traditional definition of a good investment and look at some of those underrepresented groups, such as women, people of color, Indigenous people, and what are some of those unique needs that are there and how can we support that? So those are some things that we're looking at, because INBc is really designed to fill gaps and not step on toes, right? We want to work with the private sector and be that additive piece and be that complement to other sources of capital. So really having some intentionality around where we're investing, of course. And that example around, I'd love to have that conversation further about that crowding in, because I think that's such a key piece. So really interested to learn more from this group as we're evolving and thinking about all these things, but I'm also very excited as soon as we get our investment policy statement out into the public and start to mobilize the capital and learn along the way. We're going to have to iterate and evolve as we go, but we have a lot of problems to solve, a lot of missions to focus on, and yeah, excited to move this forward. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
That sounds like a very exciting agenda. Thank you very much, Jill, for giving us that fascinating preview into this exciting new institution in BC. So I'm going to move on to now into a kind of informal conversation between all of our panelists. There were so many really interesting themes that popped up during those short introductions, and I suspect this conversation could go in many directions. So I'm quite interested to see where we go. But just as an opening provocation, perhaps to Mariana, maybe Shiva might want to come in here. This idea of conditionalities was mentioned, and also the idea of the importance of sharing the rewards of public investment, not only the risks. So perhaps Mariana, if you could start in terms of how risk sharing is important in terms of democratizing public finance for the green transition, and how public financial institutions need to be sort of designed with that kind of democracy in mind.
Yep. So for me, it's both about democracy, but also kind of confidence and narrative. And, you know, no place better than California to make that, where, you know, we wouldn't have Silicon Valley without that massive amount of public investment that was, you know, what I talked about in the entrepreneurial state, you know, internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, you name it, it came out of public funds. And yet somehow we allowed the risk to get socialized and the profits to get privatized. And of course, we all benefited, yes, from the internet, but unless you really think about the governance of the system with kind of public goods and common goods in mind, then you kind of screw up along the way, like we have with tech. Just look at, you know, the big debate right now in terms of privacy and so on. So that's why in IPP, we always talk about the need to shape and co-create markets between public and private, not just fix them. If you're fixing markets and see the role of a public bank to fix markets, just to kind of fund stuff the private sector is not financing, it doesn't kind of give you that much more proactive, framing that you need. But also in terms of the narrative, you know, and I'm thinking actually also in Camden, which is the part of London where UCL and IPP sit. We have the headquarters of Google, Facebook. We have this amazing knowledge quarter, which is, the British Library, British Museum, the Wellcome Trust, so on and so forth. But it's also side by side with one of the poorest communities, Somerstown. So how can we see the role, for example, of a Camden Wealth Fund? So this is a really super local and community-based kind of public bank called the Wealth Fund, as a way to recognize actually that value in this community is being created by all sorts of different actors. By the way, lots of music industry value has been created in Camden, but instead of all this value then going out, think of the $1 trillion hip hop sector and rap sector, which has again come out of lots of local communities globally, and all those profits kind of leave. How can we also use these funds to reinvest back in, right? To capture, not in a top-down kind of way, but to get back, risk and reward, to then also reinvest back in to nurture that value creation process itself. And on that, I think it's very interesting to link it with UBI. So the whole universal basic income debate globally. I have nothing against UBI. I just don't like the narrative behind it. It doesn't debunk the idea of where wealth is created. Whereas when you have these public banks or local community funds and so on, they can be used then to distribute something like a citizen's dividend, a citizen's share. A share of what? Of the wealth that you help to co-create. That's a very different story and narrative than business and Silicon Valley guys create all the wealth. Then a check comes in the mail to the people, the poor people who need to take, a bit of time off from working too much, so they get their check in the mail from that. This is much more about bringing agency, but also a narrative, a true narrative of where wealth is actually coming from. And people like Warren Buffett say this all the time. He's like, I wouldn't be rich without this massive social infrastructure around me, but then we don't have the institutions to actually capture that. And the notion of stakeholder value, which is out there, Larry Fink's just written his 12th letter about this. It's all talk until it's nested at the center of how different actors work together. Currently, stakeholder value is just seen as like a purpose orientation within corporate governance, is used also in reporting metrics around what used to be called corporate social responsibility, now ESG kind of metrics. But it'll remain weak until it's at the center of the public, private, and also third sector interaction. And one of that first interactions is the recognition of that collective value creation process, and then also how to redistribute that collective value to all the different actors. And I think public banks have a really important role to play, both the narrative, the framing, and the kind of tools around that.
Shiva, I wonder if you had any experiences to come in here from the European Investment Bank. In particular, your work on the circular economy, I think, could be quite relevant.
Yes, no, absolutely. Let me perhaps maybe start on the risk-reward element, because I think this is actually quite foundational also for the EIB's own sort of evolution the last, I would say, 15 years. And this is what we did together with the European Commission since 2007 was, instead we basically agreed that instead of having all their budgets go as grants, that a relatively small actually amount of those budgets would come as capital, so that they would actually do a risk sharing with us. And the point is that instead of a grant, once it's out the door. With these repayable financing products, even if you have 100% risk cover, and this is where we'll now get to, because we have some very interesting thematic finance envelopes, which may be of interest to Dan and Jill, if they are not aware of them, like the energy demo project in the green side, but also the infectious diseases finance facility. So we actually have the Commission take 100% of the risk, but and we come into areas that would not be considered bankable by commercial banking standards. However, EIB will nevertheless use its rather sort of sound banking expertise to select the right type of projects promoters, provide a loan financing, so to speak, but it actually has also warrants attached to it. So think of it like either a forgivable loan or repayable grant with ultimately also warrants. So what it means is that in the case of obviously downside risk. I mean, that the project fails, you lose the money. But okay, we, the EIB, then are made whole through this risk sharing with the European Commission. If they had given the grant, that money would anyway have been lost. Yeah. Now, in the upside case, if the project is successful, there's an upside risk, sharing through the warrant mechanism. And this has actually proven to be a very smart way for actually the EU budgets to go much further, and has been the blueprint for all the various stimulus programs under the last program and under the new Invest EU, which you may have heard, where of course, depending on the sort of product, the risk sharing may be, 10, 20%, all the way up to the 100%, where indeed you have the very high risk element. And maybe sort of, for instance, on the circular economy front, maybe to kind of touch on that, what we, for instance, realize that there are some very interesting circular economy technology solutions, for instance, the fashion sector, that indeed would not be bankable. These are very often projects that require chunky amount of capital in order to demonstrate their commercial scale ultimately. So they have initially had some grants, they have had some equity. They are not bankable, and it's that gap where our energy demo project solution comes in. And what we did through the advisory work, we identified that in the circular economy space, you actually have some really interesting technology solutions that could benefit from that. And hence there's now a special window under this sort of high risk envelope that targets those circular economy solutions as well. One of the recent companies that we finance is Renew Cell, which is a fascinating company. They have licensing agreements with the fast fashion industry, where they're basically old textiles are turned into yarn that then goes into new clothing, but without using new cotton, so to speak. So again, beautiful circular economy story. And again, here we're using these instruments where we are obviously sharing in the downside, but also in the upside. And I think that is absolutely critical if you want to get the leverage effect, the multiplier effects, and so on and so forth. And I stop here. I could go on forever and ever on this. As Mariana and others may know, this is a topic that is very close to the EIB's heart, and certainly my own personal
No, that's great. Thank you, Shiva. I really want to bring in Dan here too, because the Californian Bank has also financed a lot of circular economy projects, or is beginning to, and also to hear about the your experiences with the use of conditionalities and trying to capture the upside from public finance as well.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I think one that we don't appreciate enough as it relates to the politics, some of the long-term politics of sustainability and climate change. It's still, we're like, put on your sweater and eat your vegetables. But if we can actually start sharing some of the economic upside, then I think the political challenges, which are going to get harder in my judgment, will actually ameliorate a bit. So we have a framework where, say, upside sharing can take place at the institutional level. The IBank operates a revolving fund. We do charge interest, whether it's at market or below. We're taking other risks. All those are flexible, but the money comes back. We redeploy it. It can grow. We can go to the bond markets. We can recapitalize more quickly. So there's that at the institutional level, but I'm really interested in how those benefits actually are received and perceived at the societal level, at the individual level of households. We have an opportunity in California. We had an opportunity when we designed our greenhouse gas reduction fund, cap and trade. We created a climate dividend, which is exactly what you would want from the sale of a right to pollute, have that actually flow down, and people would receive an economic benefit and see that connection and improve their household finances as a result. But unfortunately, what we did, for reasons I cannot fully fathom, is we embedded that twice yearly in a utility bill. We basically a quarterly or twice yearly reduction in your bill reflecting the value of your climate dividend. Now, I'm an energy geek, and I don't even know when that happens or how it works. So we took a really powerful signal and completely muted it as it relates to the consumer and the household. Is it a benefit? Yes, but we missed an opportunity there in my mind. As compared to what we've seen out of the Connecticut Green Bank, which was the first in the US with their Green Liberty Bond, which is a very small scale democratic financial instrument to promote solar across the state, and then sell that bond in a very low level retail fashion at $25 denominations. Sold out instantaneously, not direct to the consumer, but everybody loved the notion And it's right there. Here's your piece of paper. You get an interest payment, you get return of principal, and it's all connected to clean energy in your community. We need to do way more of that in every sector and just make it, frictionless as a transaction. And the last thing I would point out is that, particularly as it relates to energy infrastructure, we're asking communities to host new and potentially somewhat disruptive forms of physical infrastructure in their communities. EV charging, biofuels production, solar farms. What's in it for them other than, promise of a little bit of tax base and a little bit of jobs? Why can't they participate in the financing, either on the equity or probably on the debt side, and see those dollars come right back into their communities, even as they get the jobs and the reduction of local environmental harms? It's right there transactionally, but we need institutions that go and make that happen. And I don't think there's any substitute for a public bank if we're going to do that.
Thanks, Dan. That's really interesting. Jill, did you want to come in at all?
I feel I have more questions than examples and answers at this point. I'm learning so much, which is fantastic, and just really enjoying the conversation. But maybe I can launch into a question and continue the conversation if that's all right. And then I know we're opening it up to the audience momentarily, but just really interested, we're exploring, as I said, we all have diverse economies we're working within and looking at so many different intersectionalities, and of course we're trying to decide where do we begin, even looking at different asset classes. And so Dan, some of those things you were just talking about are really interesting, and I'd love to follow up with you on a couple of points. But we're also looking at just understanding the different needs of different communities that we're working with. I don't know if we can dive into that a little bit more. If anybody has worked with, I'm sure Mariana has some examples working particularly with Indigenous peoples or even other underrepresented groups, and how embedding some thinking in around that.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually interesting because we're going to have a workshop in a couple weeks, actually in 1 week with Camden, just about that, so that it's not just about kind of redistributing, these public funds to wider stakeholders in the form of loans and so on, but also the governance, the decision making itself, the kind of governance issues that Shiva was talking about. How can we open that up? And I think it's still a big question, right? Because if we look at the whole ecosystem of actors in both public and private sector, just a minute on the public bit, you have politicians that in theory should be winning elections based on, big ideas like around the Green Deal. So let's say that's in some ways where the high level mission should be coming from. We should be electing people who actually have an idea, a vision, and make sure that our votes count for that. But then on the much more grounded level, where do these kind of missions that get debated? So in Camden, what's been interesting is the clean growth mission is very much nested within the housing estates, what in America we call projects, or social housing basically. And one of the first things Camden did was to bring resident associations, so the people living in the housing estates, to the table. So it's not just about retrofitting, making greener homes, but also debating, what does it look like actually to live together in a more sustainable way? So that kind of contestation, open debate, creating public spaces where you feel safe to disagree. I like that line. It's one that came out of a discussion I had with Oliver Elias and an artist. That itself sometimes needs to be financed, not necessarily through a public bank, but by someone if those spaces don't exist, and protected and nurtured. But one could argue that if you have real citizen engagement at that level, then these public funds, and you could look at the city level, regional, national, international level, the public funds can then help steer investment into those areas that these other bodies that are much more open with diverse voices have kind of decided. That's different from saying that on the governance of the bank itself, you would have like every single voice represented by lots of different types of people. And I think you could go either way. I don't think it's, either or. But that is a bit of a debate, like where does that opening up of co-creation and decision making, so it's not the usual suspects that decide, where money flows, where does that happen in the ecosystem, and where is it also within the public bank? How does it happen in terms of citizen engagement, basically?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And we're thinking about a lot of those things. We'll follow up with your team on some of that, Mariana, and yourself, because and even just the different levels of engagement and oversight. Lots to consider.
We have some really interesting questions coming in from the audience. I just wanted to flag one from Octavio Arellano, who asks, I guess this is a question for Shiva, can the EIB advise development banks from countries outside the EU in order to design climate financing instruments and missions?
Yes, and I'm grateful for the question, because indeed I just realized that perhaps in my opening remark, I was so focused on not going over my 5 minutes that I maybe have missed out of saying a very important point, which is that we indeed are actually financing also projects outside of the European Union. It is for us a smaller portion of our total financing, roughly 10–15%. However, given that we are, if I may say so, the largest multilateral development bank in terms of volume, roughly 70 billion or so a year, even 10–15% are still a chunky amount, and maybe half or more the size of some of the other MDBs. So yes, we therefore are very active in these countries. We have framework agreements with, I don't know, over 140 or so countries. We have just launched a new sort of the EIB Global, which is of the development branch, kind of ring fencing our activities as part of this new European architecture. So there's a lot of activity going on. And indeed, coming to the question of, therefore, the support. So we, I would say we provide technical assistance and perhaps don't do the same level of product design. However, there is a lot of knowledge sharing, and this is actually one of the things that also we took out of Mariana's work, creating this in-house knowledge and is not only relevant for, of course, our EU activities, but once you have that, it has so much applicability outside of the EU. And I think when it comes to the green activities, the green mission, so to speak, you have circular economy, which is obviously a global mega trend. You have hydrogen, where you have really the energy systems having to become integrated, and there's so much EU, non-EU dynamism going on. So yes, I think there will be much more, even in the future, that type of knowledge transfer and looking at how we can design some of these instruments. And I have to also say, well, sometimes we look at the sort of financial innovation that's happening outside of the EU, they are sometimes ahead. Maybe it's because of the necessity on the ground that they actually have sometimes products that are even more that are actually quite innovative, and that we can then bring back into the EU context. So it's definitely a two-way stream.
Thank you, Shiva. That was a great answer. Got another interesting question here to Dan. You mentioned that California has $3 billion in grant finance. Where does that come from? It seems that the private venture capital finance only gets involved once revenue streams are assured, which is a good point. And also, what sort of returns and over what timescale are they prepared to take?
Yeah, those are actually two great questions I can try and group together and answer for. So the first piece is the proceeds from our greenhouse gas reduction fund. So our carbon cap and trade program, that's the carbon pricing methodology that California aligned on, as opposed to a tax. We set a limit, we sell rights to pollute, and then that revenue comes in this case, to the Air Resources Board, and then is granted out through literally more than 40 programs. It was $3 billion last year. It does move based on the clearing price of the auction, but it's trending up. People believe that the program's real. It's getting more stringent over time. It survived legal challenges. And the state in aggregate has supported more than 500,000 individual projects with that grant stream since its inception. And we've had the chance to really push hard on this. What's now Justice 40 is sort of the rubric at the federal level in the US. 40%, now heading to 50% of the benefits going to historically disadvantaged communities. So showing up in the community with these grant dollars. How that plays to the venture community, you're right, they want return. They want, return that's decoupled from risk. But I wouldn't say that they only show up when the revenue is certain. If there's the prospect of a seriously, multiples exit, then they'll take early return risk. But the challenge in this sector is that you're selling into commodity markets, energy, as opposed to something like tech or bioscience, where there's really expensive things you can sell at the end of the day. That's not the fundamental situation in this sector. So that's why venture has been challenged in its outcomes in the last 10 years. There's been a beneficial shift in the market. I'm a big fan of where Breakthrough Energy Ventures is, the Bill Gates, more sort of family office oriented money, which can say, yeah, we're looking for returns, but we don't need to pay somebody else. We didn't raise this money from a group of institutional investors and make them promises about how much and when we're going to give them their money back. We're going to grow our own fund as a mission-oriented investor, happen to be populated by all the world's billionaires, but that's okay. We're going to invest in things that take longer to mature, maybe don't have a 20x multiple or an IPO, but we're making important infrastructure happen that will be money-making in the end. So that, I think, is the fundamental shift in the equity conversation that we need to promote. Yeah,
of course. I think that's really important. Our next question is for Jill. Quite a technical question, but I think it's an important one. So this attendee says, it is good to see your emphasis on equality, diversity and inclusion. However, how do you determine whether a business is women-led or if it's is it based on proportion of owners or leadership team? Or how do you determine kind of, what the attribute of the target business is? So in the public sector, we want to be able to track these things, but we need consistent definitions to be able to compare how we are doing compared to others. So how do you propose to kind of do that as you're launching out these things? And I appreciate it's early days, Jill, but it's interesting to see your thinking so far.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate that question because I think traditionally it has been defined as 51% women owned. That is expanding, and there's a global sort of trying to look at that as to set a global standard. I know that's adjusting, and also when you look at equity too, and if there's equity investment, that changes. And so looking at that framework, but we're also looking at even women, if women-led versus women-owned. Women-led, it has to be in influence, right? A decision-making role. We're looking at a team, across a team. It's not just having a woman and perhaps a chief of marketing role or a chief of HR. It has to be in a finance or a CEO type of role. So we are looking at, where is the influence happening? Where is the decision-making happening? So that we can define that more clearly. I think that's critically important. And when we look at, we're also going to be investing in funds. When we look at the fund management team, there has to be diversity across that as well. So we haven't, as you can tell, fully defined it, but we are considering a lot of different things and open to input around that. But it can't be, we're really, obviously, that whole tokenism piece we're trying to avoid and dig into.
This is the difficult part, isn't it, when you're moving in from ambition to actually on the ground operating the ambition in practice.
Reality.
But yes. Important questions for sure. So the last question I want to end on is for Mariana, but I invite any of the other participants here to also chime in on this because I think it's an important one. But what is your advice to Mark Carney and to his group of 450 private investors and their trillions for the green transition? So take it away, Mariana, first of all.
Yeah, and actually, Katie, you've written amazing things on that, so you feel free to tell us your, you and Josh are fantastic on this exact question. But Mark's a friend. I think he could be much more courageous, and so can the whole team. First of all, even in Larry Fink's letter just a couple of weeks ago, he was celebrating the fact that just in the last 2 years, sustainable investments have reached something like $4 trillion. But the problem is that, that's not enough if it's not coordinated. It actually doesn't lead to the kind of change we need. So, to actually have what we talk about in terms of completion of these missions, you actually need proper kind of coherent, all of government, but also these kind of public-private coordinations. And that is what the missions project is all about. We would not have gone to the to the moon through the Apollo program had NASA just said, hey, everyone, do your thing, come up to space and play, some games. And I kind of feel like that's what's happening. A lot of game playing, but also lack of coordination. And so in terms of what was agreed at COP, the problem, of course, is that it wasn't mandatory. We wear seatbelts because we get fined if we don't. There isn't yet that kind of, mandatory standard and kind of global coherent structure to these changes that we need in the financial sector. But happy for others to chip in here.
Anyone else want to comment to finish? Shiva?
Well, all I would like to say to Mr. Mark Carney and his 450 investors, they better co-invest with us so that we reach our 1 trillion goal even earlier. So please, any ones are out there, or if you come across any of them, have them be put in touch with the EIB.
Indeed. It's all about putting your money where your mouth is at this point, isn't it? And I think the 450 firms have shown their long-term commitments. We now need to see near-term milestones and also actual strategies for implementing this kind of reallocation of capital. And I think the three examples we've had here today from California, EIB and INBc and its ambitions for the future really demonstrate how to put that ambition into practice on the ground, and with some great success stories along the way. So I'd like to say thank you to our four panelists for this really rich and insightful discussion. It's been particularly great to compare and contrast the differing approaches across the Atlantic, and also bringing in some of IIPP's work and theoretical lenses as well. So yes, thank you very much. Please continue the conversation online. Moin exists to bring together a network as a continuing dynamic conversation. So don't let it stop here.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you very much for joining.
Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Good day.
Bye-bye.